Hello, everyone. After a short break, we are back with our IRENA Insights webinar series. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Martina Lyons and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn, and I will be your moderator today. Most of you know who IRENA is, but let me give you a short introduction. We are an intergovernmental organization. We have currently 161 member countries and 22 countries in the accession process. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as a principal platform for international cooperation, center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generate a lot of valuable insights, and we are constantly looking for different ways how to share those insights with you. And that's what brings us to our fortnightly IRENA webinar program, where every other week we share with you key findings from our latest work or sneak peeks into our upcoming work, and we offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. A small caveat, we aim to keep these webinars short, approximately 30 minutes. So the aim is not to really cover everything, but to rather give you enough to decide whether you want to delve deeper into the topic, and we signpost further sources in our presentation for more in-depth information if you decide to do so. Today's webinar discusses how the decarbonization of transport and industry sectors by 2060 will be very challenging due to limited viable options. Renewables supplemented with other options can play a central role in these sectors and can make an early but significant difference that would help build confidence and scale. Today's webinar will present you with early insight from our upcoming report, Reaching Zero with Renewables, which will be published by the end of September, as well as from the recent IRENA's advice, which were provided to G20 Climate Stewardship Working Group on the use of renewables in the challenging industry and transport sectors. Today's speaker is Dr. Paul Durrant, who is IRENA expert leading work on this topic. His presentation will be approximately 20 minutes long to allow additional 20 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over microphone to Paul, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. So today's webinar will be, as usually, recorded and available together with the presentation slides on our IRENA webinar website. The previous webinars are already, the recording and slides are already there, so you are welcome to visit them. The link to the website will be again shared with you in the follow-up email. You may also want to download the presentation from the handout section. You are all currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation, so if you have any questions to our speaker, please use the question feature on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speaker. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. You can use the chat feature to introduce yourself and talk to other attendees. Please also share with you how you felt about this webinar and what you think we should cover in the future in our survey, which will come up after the webinar finishes. And if you have any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone. You can get the number by clicking on the phone feature option located on the webinar panel. Otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. And without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Paul. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Martina. Well, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes or so giving you some insights into our work on this topic. Effectively tackling climate change will require the near complete decarbonizations of all sectors of the economy by the second half of this century. Now, there's no doubt about it, that will be very challenging, but particularly so in some key industry and transport sectors where viable options are currently limited. Now, thanks to the significant cost reduction, technical development, deployment, etc. of renewables in general over the last decade or so, renewables supplemented with other technologies, can play a pivotal role in those key industrial and transport sectors. But that potential has not been either recognized or fully exploited to date. Now, this is a topic that's a relatively new area of analysis for us in IRENA. However, it's a topic that is of growing interest and importance in many of our member countries. So the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what you can expect from an upcoming report that will be published towards the end of September. That report's entitled Reaching Zero with Renewables, Eliminating CO2 Emissions in Industry and Transport. Hopefully you won't object if we'll send you the link to that when it's published. Now, that's a 170-page report with a lot of detailed insights. In 15 minutes, I can't hope to do it justice. So I'm trying to give you a bit of a flavor of what to expect in the hope that you'll dive in and look at it when it is published. But in addition, we will organize in the autumn some further webinars on some of the specific sectors like iron and steel, cement, aviation, etc., where we can dive into a bit more depth. Today, I'm not going into a lot of depth. I'm giving you the overview, so hopefully that will be valuable context for you. Also, if you're interested in this topic, that is also the focus of IRENA's Innovation Week. This year is virtual, 5th to 8th of October. We have a slide on that at the end of the presentation, so do consider joining us then. Now, our report has a twin focus. It's about exploring how the world could achieve zero emissions in key industry and transport sectors, and assessing the potential role of renewables in doing so. We're trying to provide an accessible overview of the topic as a basis for more detailed and informed discussions that are frankly badly needed amongst policymakers and other stakeholders. So why a focus on reaching zero? Well, as I think you'll all appreciate, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change calls on countries to strengthen their global response to the threat of climate change by keeping global temperature rises this century well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, achieving that ambitious target of 1.5 degrees will require a concerted effort to get very close to or achieve net zero CO2 emissions across all sectors of the economy by early in the second half of this century. Now, achieving that target is challenging. So to help inform the development of national and international strategies, IRENA has developed a comprehensive data-based analytical framework that sets out a path to achieving the Paris Agreement. We publish an annual report describing that roadmap. This year's was called IRENA's Global Renewables Outlook, and it was released in April. Link in the presentation. The charts on this slide summarize some of the global renewables outlooks scenarios. So a couple of things that are perhaps useful for you to understand to provide context to the discussion that follows. The first is the planned energy scenario. This is our primary reference case, setting out what governments and industries' current energy plans and other planned targets and policies are likely to achieve. So it's a projection based on what people have said they're going to do now. That's the orange line that hopefully you can pick out on the chart. The transforming energy scenario describes an ambitious yet realistic energy transformation pathway to 2050, based largely on renewable energy sources and steadily improving energy efficiency. This would set the world's energy system on a path to keep temperature rises well below 2 degrees this century. That's the blue wedge on the chart that you see there. However, you'll note that even after those significant emission reductions in that scenario, there's still 9.5 gigatons of energy-related CO2 emissions per annum and 0.9 gigatons of process-related CO2 emissions remaining in 2050. So reaching zero carbon emissions will require further action even above what we've described in our transforming energy scenario. And that's further action across power, buildings, transport, and industry. Now, eliminating that last 10.4 gigatons is the focus of what we called our deeper decarbonisation perspectives in the GROW. It's not a full scenario, but it does provide views on additional options to further reduce energy-related and industrial process emissions. Our upcoming report, Reaching Zero, looks at some of those areas in greater depth. Now, the pathways to zero for the power sector, for buildings and non-commercial transport sectors pose their own challenges, but the pathway is reasonably clear. The optimum pathway for other sectors, however, is far less clear, looks even more challenging, and has received comparatively little attention to date. So our focus is on those sectors in transport and industry where options are limited and where insufficient attention has been paid to date. These are often called hard to decarbonize or hard to abate sectors because the technological, logistical, and economic challenges of reaching zero are challenging and the options are limited. There are in principle a range of options available that can help reduce emissions in these sectors. The challenge, of course, is to find the optimal mix of solutions that will result in zero carbon emissions in the most practical and cost-effective way. Crucially, that goal of reaching or at least coming close to zero in each sector requires a very different mindset compared to an objective of merely reducing emissions. Each of the sectors discussed in our report are in the early stages of exploring their emission reduction strategies. Many of the options that are being looked at will only result in partial reductions in emissions and are not consistent with the sector eventually reaching zero. Now, some of those options, particularly demand reduction, energy efficiency, greater use of the circular economy, are still very much worth pursuing. They may make economic sense for the sectors, or they can reduce the scale of the challenge and so assist with eventually reaching zero. However, in order to not waste resources or lose time, a clearer focus is needed on the end objective of zero CO2 emissions when we look at the options that we should be exploring now and over the coming decades. When we apply that criteria, only a very small number of currently conceived options in each sector exist. Most of those options are not yet sufficiently well proven or cost attractive to be a clear-cut choice for the sector. Now, whilst each of those sectors discussed require tailored and differentiated strategies to reach zero, they have a number of column elements. The majority of the emission reductions will be achieved through a combination of the 5 emission reduction measures that you see on the screen, 3 of which will rely primarily on renewable energy. So let's look at industry as a starting point. I'll spend a little bit more time on industry and then skip over transport quite quickly, just simply because of time. Industrial production of key materials is an essential enabler of modern economies. As countries develop and grow, demand for such material has continued to grow. But that production comes with high CO2 emissions. The 4 industrial sectors that we're looking at in our report, iron and steel, aluminium, chemicals and petrochemicals, cement and lime, account for over 22% of current energy and process-related emissions in the global energy system. The majority of that energy used in industry is sourced from fossil fuels. Energy use is not the only source of emissions in industrial sectors. We must find ways to abate emissions from the industrial processes themselves. For example, CO2 is released from the consumption of anodes in the aluminium production process, or the calcination of limestone to produce clinker as part of the cement making process also produces emissions. So finding the ways to abate those, as well as the product life cycle emissions, such as fugitive emissions produced from the use of solvents and lubricants and other compounds, or the end of life emissions from plastic waste that is incinerated. We have to look comprehensively at the energy and the process and the life cycle emissions if we're going to have a hope of getting to zero. So that's going to require radical shifts in the way in which such materials are produced, consumed, and disposed of. It hasn't received the attention that we feel it needs so far to date. And part of our objective is to raise awareness and knowledge on the subject so that it can be reflected more fully in future strategies from governments. We took a look at what the nationally determined contributions from countries showed in the most recent round, as submitted under the Paris Climate Change Agreement. In 2017, only 31 measures addressed specific industrial sectors out of a total of 2,326. A tiny proportion of measures we're looking at industrial sectors in those NDCs. This will need to change in the next round of NDCs and beyond. And there's a number of reasons for this lack of action. Two in particular I'll highlight, although there are many more. Firstly, there's currently only a few economically viable CO2 emission reduction solutions available for these sectors. And there's a lack of consensus and stakeholder acceptance amongst the industry sectors on the pathway to pursue. Second key challenge is carbon leakage, i.e. the transfer of production to other locations where emission reduction requirements are lower. This is a major effort, a major impediment to governments mandating tougher requirements in their own country. There is some good news, however. The dramatic falls in the cost of renewable power over the last decade or so opens up options that were previously dismissed as too costly. We see significant potential for further cost reduction in other renewables, particularly biofuels, green hydrogen, and synthetic fuels produced from that green hydrogen. Table shows you some of the renewable energy shares in the different sectors as projected in our different scenarios. You'll see where we can get to by 2050 in the transforming energy scenario. As I highlighted earlier, there is still a further step beyond that, a significant step to go further where renewables will also play a major role. So let's now look at some of the options. And sadly, I don't really have time to unpack these in detail. So I will let you skim the slide. And as I say, further details will follow in the report in the autumn. But I hope this will give you a sense of firstly, that there are a limited range of options across these sectors. These are the options that we think can together contribute to delivering net zero emissions, or zero emissions actually. There are some commonalities between them, but equally there are different approaches needed in each sector. All of these options have been researched or piloted to a degree, but most of them are not mature and most still face significant challenges to scale up. All of what I just said can equally well apply to a number of key transport sectors: shipping, road freight, aviation. I'll skip over this slide quite quickly because of time, but this slide deck will be available to you afterwards and the report will follow soon. Likewise, in those transport sectors, there's also a limited number of options. Let me finish, oops, excuse me, jumped ahead there. Let me finish by very briefly talking a little bit about some of the challenges that we see specific to decarbonising those sectors, but also some of the actions that are going to be needed. So on the challenge side, a common problem for so many emerging technologies, but most of the things that I was just referring to have higher costs than the fossil fuel-based solutions that they seek to replace. But compounding that problem, there are significant gaps in knowledge and also in confidence. So many of the people who have to make investment decisions face a great deal of uncertainty about the future trajectory of some of these options, and that makes inevitably those investment decisions particularly difficult to make. There's also a need, if we're going to transition to things like hydrogen, for example, for new enabling infrastructure or significant upgrades to existing infrastructure. And that infrastructure investment needs to take place before the scale up in the use of the energy carrier, for example. Many of the industries we're talking about have highly integrated operations and very long established practices. It isn't simply a matter of replacing one part, replacing one fuel supply within the operation. That can have far-reaching consequences across the whole of the plant or the whole of the operations. Investments are usually large, lumpy, and long-term. It's crucial to not miss the investment window when a plant is undergoing refurbishment or when a new plant is being constructed. Otherwise, existing processes might be locked in for a decade or two. There's an interdependency on progress in the energy sector. So we need to decarbonize the power system if we're going to provide low carbon electricity. There are significant challenges in the way in which the carbon emissions are accounted for in a number of sectors, which makes accountability difficult. I mentioned it earlier, the competitiveness challenges and carbon leakage risks for first mover countries and companies if we simply shift emissions to other locations. There are a number of legacy policy and regulatory frameworks that need updating, again, ahead of time to enable it. And we are still underinvesting in the research, development and technology that we need on some of these options. Our investment in industry and transport related R&D is a small share of our total energy investment in R&D, and our total energy investment in R&D is a small share of our sort of total societal investment in all sorts of problems. Those are the challenges. I'm pretty much out of time, so I can't really spend a lot of time on the actions needed, but you get a sense of it there. So there are a number of things that we can do. There are some encouraging signs of international collaborations beginning to emerge that are starting to look at this. This is not a problem that individual countries will be able to solve on their own. That international collaboration is crucial. We in IRENA are seeking to try and help our member states come together to, at the very least, pool knowledge and build a shared understanding, but better still, to build a shared vision of what we're trying to achieve and what the trajectory is that we need to follow. Let me finish at that point then, because time has marched on from us. I'll leave you with a few quick words about what the prospects are. So the world has made remarkable progress in the last decade in developing renewable energy resources and making positive steps towards decarbonizing the power system in particular. Collectively, it must now seek to make comparable progress in addressing carbon emissions from those end-use sectors. That 40-year transition has barely begun, but it warrants far greater attention, planning, ingenuity, and resources now if progress is going to be made fast enough. There are challenges, but there are also promising options, particularly those that make use of that low cost and abundant renewable resources. From our assessment, with the right plans, sufficient support and attention, that goal of reaching zero emissions in those key transport and industry sectors is achievable. I hope I've whetted your appetite for more information on this topic. As I say, we'll email you in the autumn with the report, but do please also join us for a number of the events that we have planned in the autumn, where we'll be discussing and debating this in more detail. Thank you for your attention. Martina, I can't hear you. I don't know if everybody else can.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you. So thank you for the insights into a timely topic, challenging, but with a positive outlook, because there are solutions which we just have to scale up. A nice teaser for the upcoming report, but let me go directly to the questions, because people are curious about about a lot of things. Let me maybe wrap up some questions. So there are a lot of questions regarding what we think are the sectors which will be the hardest to decarbonize. If you can tell us your views.
Sorry, I did it myself just then. I muted. Sorry, yes, that is a difficult question. I fear I used the word challenging too much in my presentation just there. There's no doubt about this, it's challenging. But there are, as I say, a number of options. I think the most challenging sectors are those where the emissions are innate to the processes that we currently follow. And I'm thinking particularly there of cement, where the production of clinker, which is sort of a key component of cement, it's innate to that process to produce emissions. There are things we can do in that case. We can try and reduce the proportion of clinker that we use. That will bring down emissions, but they won't eliminate them. We can try and substitute for cement with different formulations of cement. We can substitute for cement with different building materials. But all of those things are likely to merely reduce the problem, not eliminate it. Carbon capture and storage is probably the only route that actually directly captures the emissions, but there are challenges of carbon capture and storage as well in terms of not 100% effective, some cost and logistical challenges that are yet to be overcome. So I'd highlight cement in particular. I could have mentioned aluminium, where there's some innate processes to do with the consumption of the anode, and so on. But yeah, I think cement is going to be the toughest nut to crack.
Speaking of industries, there are some questions about iron and steel. For example, what are the prospects and alternatives for curbing coal consumption and reducing emissions in iron and steel industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a very interesting one, because a large proportion of the current processes for producing iron and then on conversion to steel rely on fossil fuels, sometimes coal, as a reducing agent in the blast furnace. Fortunately, there is an alternative technique called direct reduction of iron, which is actually a mature technique that has been utilized in the industry for many years now. It's more typically used in a different context. However, and it's typically used with hydrogen produced from fossil fuels. However, it is perfectly technically feasible to use hydrogen produced from clean sources, preferably green hydrogen produced from renewables, and through that process produce direct reduced iron, which can be then onward processed to steel using electric arc furnaces. If we did that, then we cut coal out of the process completely. We can remove fossil fuels from the energy supply side of things, and we can remove fossil fuels from the reduction of the iron ore process. Those two things together could get us to very near to zero emissions steel. Nobody's done that at scale yet, but a number of people are scaling up pilots right now, and it seems perfectly doable.
Thank you, Paul. And what about industry in emerging economies? There are a couple of questions about emerging economies such as cement production in Indonesia, iron and steel in India, and so on. So they're of the major importance, and a couple of participants are asking what could be the option or approaches or pathway for these countries to decarbonize that industry.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I wouldn't say that we've got the complete answer, but we do look at it somewhat in our report, and I think we in IRENA, but I think others as well, we're keen to work with, particularly with some of the large developing economies as they're developing their strategies for these sectors in the future. What I will say is action in the developing economies in particular is absolutely crucial, because there are increasing share of the production of key materials such as cement or iron and steel. I mean, China at the moment accounts for, let's say, roughly 50% or so of the production. India is rapidly scaling up. Other major economies, you cited Indonesia there, are also scaling up. We probably will see China's share of the total production fall over the coming decades, but very likely other developing economies will pick up that slack and make the difference. So this is not a developed world or developing world problem. This is a global problem. The solutions we develop for this need to work in all of those contexts, and it's particularly important for economies that are just starting to scale up their production of these key materials to get on the right track now. There are solutions that we can see that are viable in that country context, and if we can work with countries to help them make the right investment decisions now or in the next decade, then we reduce the likelihood that we will have problems down the line, either with locked-in emissions or with legacy infrastructure that is a high cost to them. So yes.
Thank you, Paul. Let me ask something about transport sector. If you can expand on the role of renewables for decarbonizing the transport, the aviation, shipping, and heavy road transport.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, in transport, we see renewables having a major role. In the three sectors that we're looking at, that is the direct use of electricity is unlikely to be a major component of the decarbonising of those sectors. In passenger vehicles, absolutely, direct use of electricity, battery-powered electric vehicles will be a major component. Less so in these other sectors because the nature of the requirements of long-haul, heavy-duty transport doesn't lend itself so well. There will be a role. So that leaves us with essentially two options: the use of biomass converted to biofuels and the use of synthetic fuels, in particular hydrogen, but also other things derived from hydrogen, such as ammonia or potentially methanol. So yeah, our options boil down to those three: electrification, direct electrification, probably a limited role in these three sectors; indirect electrification through the use of hydrogen. Difficult to predict how big a scale that will have at this stage. We have some projections, but there is a lot of uncertainty still about the scale up of that. And then the use of biofuels. Again, the challenge there is what will be the amount of sustainable bio feedstocks necessary to produce those biofuels. However, when we look at it in the round, through some combination of those three, we think getting to zero in those sectors is achievable.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe a little bit to follow up on this question, there is a question from the audience. So if zero emission goal is and will heavily rely on renewables, will we see renewable energy sources facilities for other ends than power, such as power to gas, power to ammonia, and so on?
Absolutely. That will be a key component of how we move forward on this. So as I just said, direct electrification has its role. In general, we see the use of electricity as one of the major providers of energy in the future. Circa 50% of total final energy consumption, we believe, will come from the direct use of electricity by 2050. But particularly in the sectors that we're looking at here, we are going to need the so-called power to X routes, in particular power to hydrogen, and then onward conversion to other synthetic fuels.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I will ask one more question. A little bit wrapping up. There are a couple of questions asking about whether IRENA is thinking about any working group or any kind of platform in which it will be possible to further discuss about the decarbonization of industry and transport sector.
That's an interesting question. So it is certainly our intention to provide a variety of fora for our members and industry to come together to explore these topics. As I said earlier, we do not think that enough attention has been paid to this. There are a number of big, not yet clear questions that need to be explored. So that dialogue internationally between countries, between country and industry, we think is absolutely crucial. In terms of specific proposals, Innovation Week, I think we've got a slide coming up on that just in a moment. We have recently established a platform on the topic of hydrogen, and this is intended to be a platform for the sharing of experiences and for debating policy approaches in terms of how to scale up the production of hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen in the context of renewable energy. So that's a member state platform that IRENA has established just a few months back now, and we expect that to expand over time.
Great, thank you, Paul. Well, as I would like to go on, the time is up. Thank you all for sending your insightful question to choose from, and thank you, Paul, for sharing the insight from the upcoming report, which we will be sharing with the audience when it is being published. But before saying goodbye, let me finish with a couple of final announcements. So as Paul mentioned a couple of times, we would like to invite you to our virtual Innovation Week, which will happen between October 5th and October 8th. It will be in the virtual setting, and we will be covering different aspects of decarbonizing industry and transport, and also energy carriers. The link to the website with the program is in the presentation, and we will be sharing the registration link by the end of summer. And last but not least, we would like to invite you to our upcoming webinars, next editions. You can see 3 upcoming ones. The next one will be on the 25th of August in the morning. It is a joint webinar between Sustainable Energy Development Authority of Malaysia and IRENA. It will build on the previous blockchain technology webinar and will discuss innovation for peer-to-peer electricity trading. The registration is open, and the link is here in the presentation and also on the IRENA Innovation website. So that is all from us for today. Once again, thank you, Paul, and thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye, and see you soon.